Hi, Greg Weldon here with Weldon Live for Friday, May 18th, and this is our special focus on Italy. The coalition government having been formed between the Five-Star Movement and the Italian League. Not everyone expected that they could pull this off if you go back to the election, and it's been a while. We talked about this earlier in the week, kind of how this has been on the back burner, and all of a sudden, right here in front of us, as they agree, kind of, not only to form a coalition, but on a common platform. Which would basically is defined by a massive fiscal easing, expansion in welfare, spending increases, tax cuts going to hit the revenue side, rolling back of pension reforms, which is one of the reasons, their debt has actually declined a little bit. Looking for debt forgiveness and looking to strengthen ties with Russia. All of this at a time when you're at 132% of GDP in terms of your sovereign debt. Wow. I mean, I'll tell you what, this is kind of the fuse we've been looking for really, for the past, it's got to be 2 years. We've been talking about, when does sovereign debt come back into play as a story in Europe? Of course, Italy, the most likely catalyst. Of course, politics, the most likely catalyst to the catalyst. And here you go. We have it. The election, the coalition, the platform, the policies, and the move here by Italy to kind of go off the grid. I mean, essentially, it's kind of a separatist attitude, asking the ECB for forgiveness and, to the extent the ECB's already rebuffed them. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here. We're going to look at the IMF study on debt to GDP ratio. Reinhard Rogoff, of course, the real kind of benchmark off of that, how that all ties in to the BTP bond market, we're bearish, the MIB stock market, we're bearish, the bank shares, and the euro, which may be an initial bearish influence. But, frankly, I say, if Italy's one of your weakest links, if not the weakest link next to Greece in terms of debt, for sure, removing Italy from the currency equation might actually serve to be a bullish thing for the euro. I mean, it hardens it by removing one of the weaker links, theoretically. A lot of, things to go through before we really have that discussion in a serious tone. But that's the direction already that this is taking, at least in terms of the discussions that are going on right now in all the back rooms and trading floors. Just funny. I mean, the Italian Job, that's the name of our piece. Did watch the Italian Job, the movie with Mark Wahlberg the other day, so it kind of fresh in my mind. But, when you kind of look at the two positions, I mean, what's good for one is bad for another. What's bad for another is good for one type of thing. Certainly the two leading parties, Five-Star Italian League, look at this as the coming boom in Italy, the return of Italy, growth and so on and so forth. Whereas the EU Commission and the ECB are looking at this as the coming collapse. So, again, I thought this was an appropriate and funny cartoon to lead us off. Bottom line, we just laid out the policies, that were, it's going to be, again and again and again, we talk about these things, all right, and they basically are, again, tax cuts, okay, spending increases, a universal income of 10,000 euro per citizen for everybody, and expanding debt, and looking for the ECB to wipe clean their debt holdings, which is 341 billion euro worth, okay. Luigi Di Maio, Five-Star Movement party leader, it's a separatist platform. It looks to move out from under the thumb of EU rule. It's kind of the southern Italy, the poorer part of Italy, that's kind of up in arms in terms of, feeling like the austerity has, really hurt them in terms of growth and in terms of income and so on and so forth. And, I mean, they're not entirely wrong either. I mean, so this is what makes it a difficult situation. But, getting past Berlusconi in the north and some of the richer parts of the country, I mean, the election results were shock number one. This is shock number two. And this might be even more shocking because you really didn't anticipate that the Italian League and the Five-Star Movement would be able to connect. And they have put their differences aside, and they are talking about, again, wiping clean debt, okay, basically reneging on debt. I mean, say defaulting is forgiveness, okay, getting a bailout from the ECB, and then moving more closely to align with Russia. I mean, holy mackerel. Now, again, I can understand in some ways the move here. I mean, certainly Russia has brought all of the sanctions upon themselves, no doubt about it. I mean, I don't think there's much to debate about that. But Russia is still a major power with huge, economy, with huge trade dynamics. So, of course, people that are closer to Russia, might want to, have closer ties to Russia. From an economic standpoint, there is some credibility to that thought process. But when you talk about just going completely off the rails in every direction, expanding welfare, increased spending, tax cuts, abandoning pension reforms, bottom line, expanding debt with no limits, basically, abandoning austerity, abandoning ERM, abandoning all the tenets upon which the EU is built upon, particularly in terms of Maastricht Treaty requirements on debt and deficits, and in this case, debt specifically in Italy. It's pretty interesting. Now, where it gets tricky and really even more interesting is the proposal, to basically securitize debt, that the government owes to companies and individuals. In other words, if you're in Italy and you own bonds and this is, some source of income for you, you could theoretically have those bonds, seized, for lack of a better word, replaced by kind of a new currency. Because what is an IOU other than a currency? They're going to say it's a short-term bond, it's an IOU that can be traded. Sounds like a currency to me. If you take a dollar, what is it? It's an IOU from the government. And certainly the outgoing economic minister brought it right to the forefront, saying this is a plan that's designed to disguise the fact that you're introducing a new currency. So really interesting stuff here. Not that we haven't heard this out of Italy, but this is some potential reality. All right, whereas in the past, all these ideas were floated, had no chance of becoming reality. This has a chance to become reality, as crazy as it might seem for its face value. Debt forgiveness, opting out of debt rules, ERM, Maastricht type stuff, closer alignment with Russia, abandoning immigration rules right off the bat so they can stop the flow of people into the country immediately, all right? There's so many levels upon which if the EU, sees this happen, where it does expand the chances for other places, like the Netherlands, like France, like some core countries that have already, Austria, where you've had elections that you barely kind of maintained the status quo, if you will. Creating a citizen's income, isn't that really interesting? Roughly, it's around roughly $10,000, around, what does that be, around $12,000 a year in terms of dollar terms. Tax cuts, a flat tax, the pension fund, the pension reforms being jettisoned, and then talking about setting up a reconciliation committee. In other words, an arbitration panel that would mediate disagreements between the two parties in the future. What is that supposed to be? I don't know what that is, but that's a little scary too. There's a lot of things that make you uneasy when you look at this, and at the end of the day, Five Star Movement is calling this a bomb, saying we are dropping a bomb on Europe here. And it's a positive bomb because we will return citizens their right and return Italy to her rightful place on the European stage. Now, I'm not sure what that means, rightful place on the European stage. I'm still one of the biggest European economies, all right, low inflation, they have some growth. But, at the end of the day, this is a much bigger thing where, Italy before Europe as opposed to Europe before Italy. That, I think, says it about as well as I can. Now, when we talk about the realities around some of this, bad precedent to set for sure, as far as the ECB is concerned, to allow them to wipe clean debt. They're looking for, I don't know if it was $250 billion, and that's why it is, but it's 341 billion euros worth of debt that the European Central Bank has on their balance sheet that is Italian bonds. Here is the ECB's Italian balance sheet. It makes the Fed's balance sheet now look pale in comparison. You're at 4.5 trillion euro. And look at, the latest round of QE, what it's meant. It's meant a doubling in the balance sheet. And then we look at where the level of Italian bonds is. Okay, so now if you want to say, hey, the ECB can do it, it's nothing relative to their balance sheet, that's not the point. The point is the precedence that this sets potentially for other countries to come and seek to do the same, where, hey, why not just wipe out all the debt? And that's not as far-fetched a thought process as you might want to just, kind of assume right off the get-go. There is a lot of academic theory out there that applies to the U.S. and applies to Europe, and basically push the button, wipe out the debt, and start from scratch. Who cares? Who cares? Other than the people holding the debt and looking to receive some kind of interest income, but that's almost gone because interest rates are so low. You're paying the government to hold your money in many cases. Now, in terms of that number, let's, for perspective, look at it. 341 billion of BTP holdings on the balance sheet of the ECB, which right now is about the amount they're rolling over every 12 months. It's a full year's worth of QE right now, given that you were at a peak of 1.2 trillion, on a 12-month basis, and you've tapered it now, and you'll get down to 360 by the end of September because you're 30 billion a month, okay, up from 60 billion a month. or down from 60 billion a month. So right now, this is more than a year's worth of QE if they were to actually, even contemplate doing this, which I think is so far-fetched. It barely, is worthy of discussion, but let's discuss it and then throw it out because it's never going to happen. When you talk about, spending more, borrowing more to reduce debt, it's kind of funny because, a billion here, a billion there, eventually it adds up type of thing, And when you talk about the comments coming out of European officialdom, they're pretty straightforward. And frankly, they're a little bit, kind of almost fear-mongering in and of themselves. The danger is irresponsible policies spark a crisis. And talking about this crisis being significantly more severe than has been the Brexit dynamic. Now, government debt's already expanding, okay? It did have a decline. There were some issues around, the pension reform for one thing, and certainly the fact that the ECB has been involved. And, you've had really low interest rates. They've taken some advantage of that, not enough, if you ask me, but still growing faster than GDP. You're at 2.7. This is in dollar terms. It's 2.2 trillion euro, 2.7 trillion dollars, over $100 billion a year in interest cost. Okay, if you're going to top on citizens with another $10,000 in welfare, you're talking about almost $60,000 in debt per citizen at a time when debt GDP is already 140%, and this is just in welfare costs. It's insanity. And what's amazing about insanity is doing the same thing again and again and again and expecting a different outcome. In this case, more debt should be able to bail us out. Now, in many ways, you could say the U.S. is doing the same, and frankly, they are. I mean, this is kind of a global phenomenon right now when it comes to sovereign debt. And this is why it becomes so scary when you start to think about debt implosion, sovereign debt crises. This is why the Fed wants inflation. This is why the Fed wants to get back to a symmetrical policy position, so they have some easing to do if you face another problem related to debt. And guess what? You will. It's inevitable. And in the case of Europe, we have been talking really the past 2 years, beginning of every year, we kind of ask ourselves, is this the year that Europe, revisits the sovereign debt crisis? And the past couple of years, the answer has been no. It's increasingly unlikely that answer stays as no, in perpetuity. There's no way. And here you are now with the situation in Italy, where you have a populist, separatist type of government that has power, now has formed a coalition government, has laid out some plans that are very much in line with this whole separatist thought process, and are about to put them in motion. Now, Italy's debt at 132% of GDP. I mean, they're up there with Lebanon and the Congo, for crying out loud. Greece not far behind. So they're way up there, as we know. Okay, and at a level which we have learned from a lot of empirical academic studies, leads to a crisis. At the very least, leads to a recession and negative GDP growth. You're at 132%. Now, what's interesting, off the pension reform, you're expected to bring that down significantly over the next 6 years to something closer to 116, 117%. That is not happening now. No way, no how. You're going to new higher highs. Now, the IMF in 2014 did a paper, which was a response to the Rogoff-Reinhardt study of 2010 on, is there a level, a threshold above which debt to GDP rises and you precipitate a crisis? And the thought process is 100% is that level, according to Rogoff and Reinhardt. The IMF study didn't rebuke that by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, you can read this through to yourself. Bottom line is they kind of, even hone it in to around 96%. Okay, 95, 96% rather than even 100. But, and that as a result of that, you're talking about when you get to the levels where Italy is, you're talking about a 4% hit to GDP. I mean, so how are you supposed to get out of this if you can't grow GDP and you keep growing debt? I mean, both sides of the machete are slicing away your debt to GDP ratio. Now, what the IMF study did find is that more important than the nominal level is the direction and speed of change in the debt to GDP ratio. And in the case of Italy's, it's going to go up. It's going to go up quickly, potentially, in the near term. And that means if you're at a one-year debt going down versus a one-year debt going up. So in other words, if you're above 100%, but your debt level is going down, that means it's not as much a crisis risk as if the debt levels are still rising. All right? And this is why, theoretically, I'm assuming, why Maastricht, played into, okay, well, if you're above 60, but your debt level is coming down, it's not as much of a penalty situation as if you're above 60% of debt to GDP and your debt's rising. All right. Well, now Italy's going to be rising. It's going to be rising in the short term, which means they are at risk of even deeper deficits in terms of GDP growth, something along the lines of 5 to 6% drag on GDP from this debt dynamic, at least going forward. The thought process is spend your way out of it. But, this is not pure spending, first of all, so we'll see how this goes. Can they avert this kind of GDP result with growth, giving money back to consumers? Will they go out and spend it? I mean, it's going to be an interesting experiment if they, kind of institute all these things. It really will. It'll be an experiment for the ages. And, depending on what the outcome is, other countries may follow. The question is, do you get a short-term benefit at a much worse longer-term scenario? And that seems to be the way these always go. And it is more of the same, pushing it further back, kicking the can down the road, and that can gets bigger and bigger and bigger until someday you kick it and you break your foot. I don't think they're there yet in terms of Italy. Obviously, they can go further. The question is, how does this potentially precipitate some kind of bigger picture crisis? When we talk about the debt, here's the government debt, here's the international debt held by financial corporations and non-financial corporations, and you can see the financial sector debt back on the upside, $834 billion. It was coming down as you kind of, recapitalized the banks, and you had all the, reform in the banking system and so on and so forth. But it's rising again. All right, number one. Corporate side to the upside, you can see $160 billion. Throw it all together, and you're above $3.2 trillion again in total debt, with the bulk of that, of course, government debt at 2.2 and change in euro terms. Okay, yes, not a new high on its own, but growing faster than GDP and thus at a new high relative to GDP. Of that debt, 1.9 trillion is in government bonds. 1.9 trillion euro, that is, about $2.5 trillion. And thus we get to the crux of the matter, which is the BTP market. Now, with the official ECB policy rate still at minus 45, all right, you can see here where you're kind of, in terms of your 3-month deposit rate, it's bidding to break out. And it will, if you look at what the ECB has told us in terms of forward interest rate hikes, scheduled for next year, so that this will be higher and rising. Well, that seems problematic given how low it is, given how coiled it is, given how pushed below the surface of the water this beach ball really is, that when you let it go, look out. You might say neutral in Europe might be 0, as opposed to in the U.S. where it is actually the rate of inflation, because you can't pin a rate of inflation in Europe, and certainly not in many countries. It's not legitimate to think neutral is 150 repo. It's not. So we say some small positive level, in my mind, could be the neutral equivalent in Europe to what 2% or 2.5, 2.25, 2.5 is in the U.S. Fed funds. All right, that's still a big jump from here. The problem is, what if you get loose? Look what happened in 2011 when you had a sovereign debt crisis. This was 6%. This is the risk here, that things blow out and this entire ball of wax collapses, onto itself. That is kind of a supernova of debt. Now, the 2-year gets hit because a lot of this debt is short-term, frankly, okay? And the ECB has been basically keeping this artificially low. So here you are now. No wonder you've popped from below 0. And you are now at a positive rate and breaking out on the 2-year. Okay, so let's look at the breakdown of redemptions. Okay, here's your short-term paper, a lot of which has been rolled over already. All right, with what's left, about $100 billion in BTPs. Okay, you got maybe another $25 billion in other debt. Okay, but the thing is, why this is not like a ticking time bomb this year is look at the coupon on a lot of this debt. All right, you go forward 3.5 in June, 4.50 in August. 3.5 in December. You only have a small amount of it that is coming due at a rate that's going to be higher, maybe, than it is now in terms of the 2-year, the 5-year, the 10-year BTPs. Going forward, that changes. Going forward, the numbers go up. Next year, you're talking about $162 billion in BTPs alone. Okay, that's number one. And total, almost $250 billion next year. All right, at a time when theoretically the ECB is raising rates, and you have an issue here with spending and revenue down because of tax cuts and so on and so forth, and your budget. Wow, talk about that, and then talk about 2020 BTPs. Okay, and now you start to see these. This is kind of the more paper maturing that carries historically low yields. So now, instead of the bulk of it being 3.5 or 4, 4.5, the bulk of it's below 1. Almost $100 billion of it in 2020, And then going forward, you're talking about a huge amount of debt in 2021, 171 billion, all right? Mixed in terms of the coupon, but that may not matter by then, by 2021, okay? Even the 3.75 may be lower than what you're going to roll it over at, maybe, we'll see. In total, a third of Italy's 2.2 trillion euro in debt comes due in the next 3.5 years. That's a problem, especially when you're talking about adding on new debt to fund these programs. This is where it becomes something more significant as we look at the 2-year here. I mean, almost 8%, you know, as recently as 2011, you know, and here it is just coming from below zero, violating the multi-year downtrend line, violating the 2-year moving average. I mean, this to me is the iceberg. Italy's the Titanic heading directly at this thing full speed ahead. So we see the BTP futures. Look at this week's action. We talked about this last Friday. And then boom, look what we see this week. We got short. We got short relatively well compared to where we are now. Could have maybe done better had we just pulled the plug, but we wanted to see these levels violated in the moving averages and really even this trend line. And we got it. And we're short. And you can see it's a bigger picture trade here. I mean, it really is. We see some significant upside potential in our BTP short position. It's a trade we basically waited with great patience for over 2 years to enact. It really goes back to 2000, gosh, even 2014 and 15, you know. So from that perspective, rolling over here, violating this, you know, multi-year uptrend line, it goes back to the low reached during the last crisis in 2011. So it's basically, you know, a 7-year uptrend that's being violated here. Now we know it also the 30-year. I mean, this is a really tight chart, man. I mean, you got double bottom down here below 2. You came up here, you got a 50% retracement. Now you're violating the downtrend line. You're back above the moving averages, which are cycling higher, above 350. I mean, this got some juice. And the curve, by the way, in Italy is steepening throughout this entire little process. So, again, in a nutshell, coming boom, coming collapse. Well, I don't know if there's a coming boom in MIB. Maybe there is. Maybe this is the thing that benefits. You know, the problem is they don't have their own currency to depreciate. If they did, I wouldn't want to be short the MIB. But they do not. And they have the euro. And they have all these problems. And you have potential capital flow. You have the banks. You have a lot of things that could kind of go wrong here, and I think the risk dynamic here is still heavily skewed to the downside, particularly given this whole rally here. The high is 24,175 in the nearby futures contract. That's exactly to the tick, the high in 2015. And look what happened after that. You are now on the verge of potentially testing the 52-week, the previous low, the uptrend line, the 2-year with the stochastic rollover. I mean, that could be a lot of downside, and you can see the levels here between 22.8, 22.3, and all the way down to 22,000. This is, you know, pretty solid support. But we'll see if you slice through this, and the next thing you're below 22,000. This thing is going to be bad news in terms of the MIB. Now, what's interesting is the bank's leadership on the downside. You just had some decent earnings, particularly Monte Paschi, which generated some price increase and the speed and degree to which we haven't seen in a while in Italian banks. And that is all wiped out in a matter of 3 days. 3 days, including a 3% down day on Friday. Monte Paschi finished down 2.5, but was down 5 at one point. And you see BPER Banca is down 6.6. I mean, so really getting whacked and threatening the uptrend line goes back 2 years in the bank index, the MIB bank index. In that vein, we look at Unicredit as kind of a benchmark bellwether, so to speak. What's interesting is this high is precisely at the 38% retracement. You missed it by 10 one-hundredths of a point, you know, 10 ticks, okay, which is minimal. Okay. In the meantime, you have a double top at the 38%. You violate the uptrend line, goes back to 2016. You violate the 52-week moving average. You violate the most recent lows. 1547 is your last gasp support level here. And if you look at the long-term picture, I mean, this is the problem with Italian banks. I mean, you can talk all you want about their recovery, quote unquote, and I make the air quotes here at my desk because I do that. Okay. But these things are still hanging on by a thread. In the case of Unicredit, you can see here the chart. Horrible. I mean, you know, you're a lot closer to zero than you are anywhere near even your post-split highs around 180. So at the end of the day, is it the return of the lira that they're dreaming about here and a harder euro? Because, you know, to me, that's kind of what happens. But the first phase of this course is a broader European sell-off crisis, you know, and here the euro gets whacked. It's below the 52-week moving average after a beautiful A, B, C, 38, 50% retracement of the entire decline. You can't map this out almost any more perfectly. Then you come back down here. Here's your reaction low, and boom, you threw it. You threw the 52-week. Now you've got the 2-year. Now you've got the stochastic rolling over, and potentially this becomes a bigger picture decline than just 115, which is now at risk. But I do have to say, at some point going forward, you have to think that, floating the idea of removing Italy from the euro currency and giving them back their lira only serves to harden the euro, because you're removing potentially one of the weakest links. We are short the BTP futures and already sitting on a bit of a profit on this trade. That's it for today. That's it for this week. Have a great weekend. I'm back at you on Monday.